Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope you and your families are safe and healthy. My name is Diana Silver, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. I want to thank you for joining us. Before we get started, I want to provide you with some technical instructions. Slide. With the exception of the presentation of our colleague from Montevideo, the webinar will be conducted in English, with simultaneous translation to French, Korean, and Spanish. However, the webinar will be conducted in English, so English speakers do not need to choose a channel throughout the presentation. English is the default. There are moderated discussions after each of the speakers' presentations, so you have an opportunity to ask questions of them. Please use the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen to submit those questions, and be sure to include your city when you do. I also want you to feed your questions into the Q&A right as they occur to you. You don't need to wait until the end of the presentations. Also, we're going to launch a poll during the webinar, so please take a moment and respond to it when it appears. Next slide. As I said, my name is Diana Silver, and I'm a professor of public health policy at New York University's School of Global Public Health. I want to welcome you to the Bloomberg Philanthropies Partnership for Healthy Cities COVID-19 Global Leadership Series. This series of 60-minute webinars for city COVID-19 and other health agency leaders is one of the resources that Partnership for Healthy Cities is offering to its global network to boost their response to this global crisis. The series is supported by Bloomberg Philanthropies and is in partnership with the World Health Organization and Vital Strategies. In a moment, we'll be joined by Amanda McClelland, Senior Vice President at Resolve to Save Lives. Later, we'll be joined by Sandra Mullen, Senior Vice President at Vital Strategies, Mervat Al-Murat from Amman, Jordan, and Dr. Annalise Barron from Montevideo, who will share their experiences. And finally, Jamie Guerra at the World Health Organization, who will share some resources with us. And then there's you. You are joining us from over 45 cities around the world. Slide. The purpose of these webinars is to provide you with updates on the evolving COVID science and pandemic, expert briefings on responding to the pandemic, and opportunities to share your own city's experiences and challenges. The objective of today's webinar is to focus on crisis communications during the pandemic. In our webinar last week, we reviewed the adaptive response framework and discussed implementing physical distance measures. During that webinar, many of you raised concerns about risk communication, and that's why we chose this topic for today. Slide. We'll begin by getting an update on the pandemic from Amanda McClelland. Amanda is an expert in international public health management, especially in emergency health, epidemic control, disease prevention, and response operations. Her achievements include coordinating frontline Ebola response during the 2014 Ebola epidemic, for which she received the 2015 Florence Nightingale Medal for exceptional courage. Again, be sure to put questions for her into the Q&A. Amanda, let's get started with you. Slide.
Great, thank you so much, Diane, and I'm happy to be with you all here. So the current situation update, it's almost getting to the point where we should stop looking at individual case numbers. The case figure at the moment is 2.5 million, on its way to 3 million, we would think, in the next few days. There's 177,780 confirmed deaths, but we know there's large underreporting and lag in death reporting, and more than 212 countries or territories reporting cases. I think the key to this slide is really that we have a large a bulk of the caseload coming from the Americas, mainly driven by the US, but increasingly in South America and still a large bulk of cases coming from Europe. We're still not seeing the cases that we would expect in parts of Africa and Southeast Asia. Slide. So this slide really shows us the pace of change of the outbreak. So you can see that this was almost 2 weeks ago. This slide shows us in the darker yellow colors where the rate of change or the exponential growth of the outbreak is the highest. You can see decreasing in the US and small pockets of transmission across a number of countries, including India and Russia. But just 2 weeks later, the picture looks very different. Slide. This slide is a little bit deceiving. I'll have to talk to the team. Actually, New York City, New York Times, who makes these slides for us, changed the scale yesterday. So this looks much darker and like there's a lot more cases spreading. So we will send an update of this, but essentially this shows that actually there's been a decrease in spread because they had to change the graph, and those dark colors now are a doubling of cases in every 7 days. So the whole outbreak has slowed down significantly to the point where we're able to change the scale that we're looking at. 7-day doubling is much more manageable. It's still not good. We'd like to see a doubling of cases out over 10 days, which is that lighter color that you're now seeing in the United States and Canada. And we can see good control coming into place in places like Australia, who have really pushed the caseload down, Australia and New Zealand, down in single-digit figures in terms of controlling the outbreak right now. So overall, the picture is a slowing of the outbreak in most countries, but still massive gaps in testing and problems in reporting. And so we will see pockets of outbreaks. And I think Singapore is a good example where there was good control measures in place. They've had a large super spreading event in a vulnerable population and getting 1,000 cases a day. We will see that come up a lot over the next couple of weeks. Slide. So in terms of the cities, obviously this is still impacting cities heavily, as we've discussed before. This is an urban outbreak, and that's where we will feel and see the impacts. Wuhan officials have revised the city's coronavirus death toll up 50%. This is really about just the fog of war, as we call it, in terms of data collection at the peak of epidemics. It's very difficult to keep on track of the numbers when they're so high like that. We've seen a revision of death toll even here in New York. There is a lag in especially identifying community deaths. So this isn't unusual and shouldn't be interpreted negatively outside of the fact that there was a lot more deaths. Dubai extends 24-hour coronavirus curfew for a whole week, and Ramadan prayers are banned in Jerusalem because of fears of the virus. And hunger and uncertainty under Delhi's coronavirus lockdown. So we're seeing now, starting to see the impacts at city level around these lockdown or shutdown measures that a number of communities are using. So I'll stop there in case there's any specific questions around the situation update. Otherwise, I will hand over to the risk communications team.
Thanks so much, Amanda. We have a couple of questions for you from one city. I'm not exactly sure where that's coming from. It says, some cities or countries have begun revising their counts. Can you tell us a bit more about why they are doing that and how they're getting data to do that?
Yes. So the revising of counts isn't unusual. What's difficult in this outbreak is defining a COVID case outside of other respiratory illnesses. We also have a lack of testing for confirmed cases. So some countries and cities were only counting lab confirmed COVID cases. We're now seeing that that's a fraction or a tip of the iceberg in many places, as lab testing was slow to scale up in many locations. So some countries are now reporting what we call confirmed cases and probable cases, cases that are most likely to be COVID, but haven't had a confirmed lab test. So you will see the numbers reported slightly differently. Most places will report confirmed and probable. And this is what you're seeing also with the death tolls. Now that we're seeing a large number of community deaths in some locations, including China and New York, those figures are being added as probable COVID deaths.
Great, thanks so much. We have another question. What trends do you imagine in cities in low resource settings over the next 2 weeks?
So it's very broad question. I think it's going to look different in different cities. We've just finished some analysis for Africa that shows that the implementation of the public health social measures early seems to have slowed the outbreak considerably. We don't see the levels of transmission that we would expect there, and that populations are changing behavior and reducing transmission. But we also see that those low resource settings, and especially urban environments, can't maintain the level of physical distancing for prolonged periods of time. And we will start to see people have to break physical distancing rules to get access to food and money and key commodities. And so we expect to see the transmission come up in the next couple of weeks as people, the impact of having to stay at home really starts to cut into food security and wage security.
That's terrific. Thank you so much for answering those questions. We have just one more. You mentioned that you're starting to see some rise in cases in a few other places. Can you just review what those were?
Yeah, sure. I think we will see rises in cases in a number of locations as testing improves. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there's more cases. It means they're identifying more cases. I think what we're looking at more importantly is where we're seeing large uncontrolled transmission or super spreading events that could potentially spread. I think what's important to remember is that this isn't necessarily about case numbers by themselves. We won't be able to, there's a few places, and I think Australia, I'm a little bit biased, but Australia is doing a good job in terms of perhaps getting back to containment. The numbers are really down to single digits. They're implementing physical measures very carefully. And so those countries, they may be able to dampen the outbreak down for prolonged periods of time. But other locations that have had large outbreaks are going to have to moderate or control the level of cases they have by turning PHSMs on and off. So it won't really be about the number of cases because we can't stop the transmission. This is a highly infectious disease. So we will continue to get cases. What's important is the rate of the cases, so the doubling of the cases, and how controlled the exponential growth is and how well the health system can manage that. So we continue to look at the number of cases as an indicator, but there's a lot of other triggers that are probably becoming more important to look at in terms of understanding performance.
Great. Thanks so much, Amanda. We're really grateful for your insights here. All right, now we're going to move on. So next slide, please. Now I'd like to introduce Sandra Mullen. She is a Senior Vice President for Communications for Vital Strategies. Prior to joining Vital Strategies, which was the World Lung Foundation, in 2007, Ms. Mullen worked for 12 years in New York City government as Communications Director to the New York City Council, the city's legislative body, and as Director of Communication for the New York City Department of Health. She's a skilled practitioner in and crisis communication and led health communication for the health department during the World Trade Center terrorist and anthrax attacks in 2001, and helped manage outbreaks of West Nile virus and other communicable diseases. She was also engaged in the city's preparation for avian flu and SARS, and the possibility of biological, chemical, and nuclear attacks, as well as natural disasters. She has directed numerous media campaigns on tobacco control, HIV/AIDS, influenza, asthma, child safety, tuberculosis, and mental health. Now, let me again remind you before we turn to Sandy to please feel free to put your questions into the QA function as they occur to you. Sandy?
Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. Thank you, Diana, for that introduction. So I want to begin with quote from Dr. Tedros, which reminds us about the importance of communication when we're in the midst of any kind of outbreak, epidemic, and certainly in the case of where we are right now, this global pandemic situation. So let me just tell you what I'm going to try to accomplish in the next 20 minutes, if not less than that. I want to go over the key concepts of risk and crisis communication, the potential application or the practical applications to you who are facing COVID-19, the importance of community engagement, and we'll also provide you with some reminders, which I'm sure you'll be quite familiar with, about managing the media during a crisis and in general, but particularly during a crisis. Next slide, please. So Amanda did a great overview of what the sort of situation is around the world, and this is just a reminder that depending on where you are in the evolution of your outbreak or your epidemic, it's important to remember to communicate in proportion to that. Next slide. So Amanda went over to some extent or at least mentioned how NPIs are providing some degree of perhaps slowing down of the outbreak in places like Africa, and how they've been adopted early on in places like Australia, and they seem to be having a great impact there. But needless to say, and I think that this is the biggest struggle that countries and cities are facing, there's a tremendous sacrifice, if you will, or difficulty in implementing these measures because of all of the other sacrifices that might take place in terms of jobs and economics and poverty and all of the barriers that people face around the world. Next slide. So we definitely need to, as leaders, communicate measures that you're taking and why every intervention is important. Explain what you want the community to do so that they can take some degree of control over their own lives and protect themselves and their families. Make sure that you are constantly assessing the course of action and that you revise them as conditions evolve. So, for example, we're in lockdown to a large degree here in New York City, and there's a great deal of impatience about coming out and getting back into life again. But we have to take into account where we are in terms of the epidemic and what barriers need to continue to be put in place. But we need to constantly communicate about why those are important. And needless to say, the more people understand why these measures are put in place, the more they're likely to adopt them and comply with government direction. Next slide, please. So these are the principles, or these are some of the things that we know about COVID that, again, inform the way that we implement these measures. Transmission occurs frequently among close contacts. It occurs among people who are infected and do not yet have symptoms. And even more troubling is that it can occur between people who are infected and never develop symptoms. So the asymptomatic aspect of this is really, in some ways, the most concerning, and which is why these measures are put in place as broadly as they have been in cities like New York and in cities around the world. And increasingly, we're seeing that they are working to some degree, but there's a great deal that's unknown about the future. Next slide. This is a slide that Amanda and her team created about the importance of putting social measures on and off depending on where things are in the stage of the pandemic. And this is, again, something that we would, in risk communication, advise that leaders tell their citizenry about, that this isn't just turning on the tap and then turning it off and that's the end of it. It's really about being able to titrate the measures depending on where you are in the epidemic, and being able to communicate the dilemmas about that cities have to face, or the challenges that cities have to face in terms of putting these measures in place. And the hope is that they're not turned off so quickly that we see a reoccurrence of the outbreak and even a worse consequence than what we were dealing with originally. Next slide, please. Again, this is something that a reminder from Amanda. This is a quote that she grabbed from not sure who, but But this is, again, the trade-off that occurs when these measures are put into place. Many people around the world, including in many of the cities that you're engaged with, have far fewer advantages than those of us in higher income settings, in that the trade-off is, should I go hungry or should I comply with government burdens and government measures and the burdens that they can potentially cause? And we're seeing that tension emerge around the world. Next slide, please. So again, this is just a reminder with a bunch of visuals that it's important to be proportionate to the situation in your country, or your city, I should say. Next slide, please. A reminder about the importance of thinking about who the city spokespeople will be to manage the crisis from a communication standpoint. Presumably, your mayor will be in charge and will be the city's main spokesperson, but there may be others who need to be trained and identified and trained as well, so that they're speaking consistently, sending consistent messages, and messages that are empathic, and I'll go through the list of areas that are really important to remember as you're communicating to your publics. I will just comment on the last point here, which is daily communication is required when you're in the midst of, certainly in a situation like we're facing in New York, and that cities around the world are facing. If you don't communicate daily, and we would recommend doing a daily press conference, even if it's virtual, but a daily telebriefing. If that is not happening, then the information gap will be filled by others. And so we really recommend, based on our experiences, that daily briefing, if done well, is a very valuable communication pipeline for your populations. Next slide, please. Needless to say, in ordinary life, misinformation abounds about public health and about health issues, and it is especially important during a crisis to be able to identify the misinformation and to be able to address it. And I'm not suggesting that you go back and forth with trolls on social media, but again, given the bully pulpit that the mayor occupies and the city occupies, be ready to counter misinformation with factual information. And consider, for example, having a person who's designated to be your social media person, who's really looking at the misinformation or rumors that are emerging in your environment, and make sure that that person is armed with the best possible information there is to try to stomp out those rumors. Next slide, please. So this is a quote from a former spokesperson at the Centers for Disease Control, who I worked very closely with after the September 11th attacks. The right message at the right time from the right person can save lives. And we're seeing examples of where the wrong message from the wrong person at the wrong time is leading to the very opposite of that. And so this is a principle that I think should guide all of us as we think about the role that communication can play in helping us get through these times. So requirements, strategies by which government officials and community leaders can promote critical protective actions for their constituents and stakeholders. It really matters that you understand people's perceptions, and those of you who are very engaged with your city will know what people's preconceptions are, what their belief systems are, what their values are, what their ethics are. And if we were talking about really having time to prepare for a crisis, we would even be saying, do some investigation of that, do some insight gathering, do some message testing. We're obviously in a situation in many places right now where I think a lot of leaders are moving on the fly, but make sure that you proceed with that knowledge in mind, because the more that you understand what people's preconceptions are, the more you can tap into how you can start to change and alter their beliefs if necessary to try to get them to comply with protective measures for both themselves, their families, and their community. And I mentioned already the importance of the early identification and management of rumors. I'm going to take a minute in the next slide to reference a model that Peter Sandman, a well-known risk communication expert, has put out into the world and comes back to quite frequently. And I'm really only going to talk about the crisis communication box in this quadrant. And if you go to the next slide, please, Nana. So he essentially has formulated that risk equals hazard plus outrage. And what he means by that, next bullet, is that people tend to be underly concerned about health threats on the advocacy side of the spectrum. And we spend a lot of time trying to get people and policymakers to pay attention. In crisis communication, people are reasonably very concerned and the hazard is high. And that's a much different situation than the NCD work that we're accustomed to doing. I wish people would be more concerned about smoking and drink driving and other behaviors that are very damaging to their health, but we have to shake them to try to get them to pay attention. In this instance, except for situations where it's taken a while for leaders and others to really focus on the risk that is clear and dangerous, as is the case with COVID-19, we usually have to help people to manage their fear. And I think that's where we certainly are in our city in New York. It's where several cities are around the world. And keep in mind that this is a time when you have to help people to manage their fear and to engage in constructive and self-protective behavior, again, for themselves, their families, and their cities. And of course, as you all know, the media is interested in almost nothing else right now. It's hard to get them to pay attention to anything else. And in some ways that's good, because we need them to be, I won't say partners, but we need them to be engaged with these issues. And sometimes I think in some cultures and countries and cities, I think the media can play a very important partnership role, but at the very least, we need to make sure they're reporting as responsibly as possible. Next slide, please. This is the greatest challenge. I helped to manage, as did some of the colleagues of mine on this call, and many of you are aware that New York City was obviously the subject of a significant attack in September of 2001. We had weeks of uncertainty. This is much different. I don't think any of us have faced a challenge like this before. And what's particularly challenging is that we're learning something new every single day. And so what we're hoping that we've landed on a few principles that will remain true throughout this pandemic fight. But we have to be prepared to bring new science into the way that we're thinking and in the sort of messaging that we provide to the public. So a good example of that is, and even though there is some ambivalence about the science here, in our situation, we were not wearing masks in the beginning, and now that's a government requirement for when you walk outside of your house to go for a walk or to go shopping. And I think both the science evolved on that to some degree, but as well did public fear and public concern, and it was something that we could give. We came down. The government of New York, came down on the side of letting people take a self-protective measure, and we'll talk about the importance of giving people something to do in just a minute. I'll continuously talk about the importance of countering misinformation and the importance of adapting your communication in terms of where you're on the pandemic. Next slide, please. These are the guiding principles of risk communication. They're pretty well accepted. There are more of these that we could go into. So, but these are the ones that we, for the most part, land on being accurate, credible, expressing empathy, providing anticipatory guidance, that is telling people even what the worst possible things will be down the road. Trust that people will be more able to accept a warning about how they can protect themselves than they will be able to recover from over reassurance. And we're certainly seeing in the United States, our president is constantly trying to reassure us or over reassure us about this thing going away, and we're perhaps overly concerned about it. And all the scientists are saying actually the worst is still yet to come. So people are more able to take care of themselves and their families and to know what to do if they're given more information rather than less, and they're not being overly reassured. So next slide, please. This is a reminder that that sometimes things do get more and more uncertain and more scary, and we have to be prepared to help people to manage their concern. Next slide. I'll also say that mention of people bearing their fear is something that was said by the city leader after 2001 when asked how many people were potentially dead in the World Trade Center buildings. His answer was more than we can bear, which was a way of both avoiding answering the question directly, but it also said, let's bear this together. Let's go through this crisis together. So clearly, public health scientists the data needs to drive the response. We have to continuously help people to understand their risks, that there are differential risks in COVID-19. What seems to be fairly consistent is that vulnerable populations like the elderly, those with underlying conditions seem to be most at risk here. And again, we have to help people to know how they can continue to adapt. Next slide. A picture tells 1,000 words, and these are just examples of posters that we've grabbed from various places. Keep going, thanks, next slide. To sort of show people what they need to do instead of just telling them. And the importance of these visuals continues to be really important in this instance. These are just some covers that we thought we would show of mask wearing. This was during the SARS scare, and the mask is really becoming a symbol of what we're dealing with here and what we've dealt with in past concerns. Next slide, please. Engage the community, get them to work with you. Make sure you take advantage of the trust that has already been built, whether it's with faith leaders, youth groups, private sector groups. Involve them as much as you possibly can, because they will help you to get those messages out and to enable them to stick among people. Next slide, please. Another reminder about the importance of faith leaders. I know that Amanda saw this a lot in Africa, that this was a very important group of people to engage in the Ebola fight. Next slide, please. I'm moving quickly because I know that time is going. So these are some of the challenges. We need to make decisions rapidly. Sometimes we don't have all the data that we need, but we need to still move ahead and use control measures and adapt our decision-making process. Next slide, please. This is a photograph of Mayor Lori Lightfoot. She is the mayor of Chicago. And one of the things that she did was start wearing a mask early. Some leaders, as you know, have avoided doing that, but she wanted to use herself to show how wearing a mask can actually be protective of others, even if not self-protective. And I think that message is a bit mixed right now, but I think getting people to comply with wearing a mask is the most important thing. I'm going to skip this infomercial that she's done, but it is essentially a 30-second spot that shows her doing things at home and showing people the kinds of things that she can do, that you can do to stay at home. So using mayors in information dissemination, using themselves, showing their own way of staying safe and providing an example to others is a good way to set an example. This is a clip that I'll play some of and then stop, of Governor Cuomo of New York speaking at a recent press conference, where I think one of the things that you should listen for is the empathic way in which he talks about how we're going to deal with this crisis together. So let's hear just a few seconds from this clip. Thank you, Nana.
Tomorrow is Easter. For Christians, Catholics, it's a very high time of the Holy Year, Passover week, to our Jewish brothers and sisters. And it's, to say different, everything has been different, but not going to church, not celebrating, Palm Sunday was last Sunday, not celebrating, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, Easter Sunday, is different and hard, But it is the same message, right? Whether you do it from home, whether you do it over a television or through a computer screen, it's the same message. And if anything, that message is more profound during this situation than it normally is.
Thank you, Nana.
New York paused. We paused.
Great. Next slide, please. So
We slowed down.
Governor Cuomo has been hosting daily press conferences, and those have been considered to be very reassuring to New Yorkers because he's being honest and frank about the situation rather than over reassuring. I'll just show this for 10 seconds. It's a conversation between Mayor Bill de Blasio prior to shutting down the city with as you can see, Trevor Noah of The Daily Show. And I'm showing this example. I could show many examples of things that Mayor de Blasio hasn't done very well, but in this instance, he's sharing a dilemma, and he's sharing it publicly, yet through this talk show format. So can we play that for just a minute?
I think an honest conversation is actually calming. I think telling people, we did a thing here in New York every day. We say, here are the numbers. We try and give them a sense of what's happening to people. Mm-hmm. We try and be really honest about what we know and what we don't know. I think that's another thing. People want to hear the truth. And sometimes I know what I don't know is the most honest statement you can make.
Right.
And so nobody on earth fully understands this disease. It's brand new. But we know enough to know that we can fight it and that we can deal with it. And we also know it is not, look, we had Ebola in New York City. Mm-hmm. Let me tell you.
I brought it, I know.
Okay.
Thank you. Trevor Noah, never missing a beat. And I'll show you this very quickly as well. This is an example of how New York is trying to come together in terms of creating an esprit de corps, we're all in it together message. And this was put out by New York State. And it's really celebrating the heroes in this fight, which are the healthcare workers on the front line. Go ahead, Nana, please. Thank you.
In the coal mine. What happens to New York is going to wind up happening in your city and in your community. We are going to fight every way we can to save every life that we can. We are all first responders. Your actions can either save or endanger a life. Job one has to be save lives. That has to be the priority.
Thank you, Nana. So I'm closing out very, very quickly with a few media tips. Remember that the media is a business, and they are certainly part of our community as well, and obviously are concerned about their own families and their own cities. But remember that that they thrive on drama and excitement, simplicity rather than complexity. They're constantly trying to feed the 24-hour news cycle. They're looking for new angles. They often will work with diminished information verification, and you really have to help to manage them as well as you possibly can. So I just wanted to remind you of that relationship with the media. And then keep in mind too that the coverage by the media can sometimes start very positively, but often ends up turning on you if you're not doing the right kind of communication. So be prepared that coverage can become negative. Next slide. And then again, in terms of communication, I've mentioned the importance of frequent communication, and I've also mentioned the importance of making sure that if you don't have the answers, say that you're working on getting them, and resisting the urge to say such things as, I want to reassure you, and stay calm. Instead, be reassuring and be calm. And the last thing I'll say is that we also have to be prepared for after the crisis subsides, to motivate people to take action, to promote community preparedness, document and share lessons, and continue to express empathy for those who have suffered or are continuing to suffer loss. And of course, be prepared to determine plans for the future. Next slide. So these are some tools which I know my colleague at WHO will fill you in more about in terms of resources that are available. But having all of these tools is critically important. So I'll end my presentation there and say thank you very much. And I'm sorry I took a little bit more time, and I'll turn it back over to Diane. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sandy. That was a fantastic presentation. We do have a few questions, although not as much time. So let me ask one of them, but assure everyone who's listening that if we don't get a chance to answer your question, we will get back to you about it. And Sandy, I'll ask you to stick around through the whole, in case we have time at the end to answer some of these. But let me go back to the first question that we received from the mayor of Quezon City, Josefina Belmonte. And she asked what the global community is doing about the spread of fake news on social media platforms, which are being used as instruments for social instability and the instigation of divisiveness.
Yeah, it's really tough for, and I'd love my colleague at WHO to perhaps chime in, because a lot of what we do certainly at Vital Strategies is we constantly refer to the WHO website and the Centers for Disease Control and other authoritative sites. And we use our social media feed to get those legitimate sources of information out there. So I think different things are happening in different places, but we have to look to our global partners to really lead the way in making sure that all of us can grab the best answers possible.
Thank you, Sandra. And this is Jamie. I'm happy to expand on that. And it's also in my presentation because there's a huge amount of misinformation going around. And I've also put a link in the chat about what WHO is doing to manage this infodemic, as we're calling it. And one of the things that we do is really listen both on social media and traditional media to see what rumors are cropping up, as well as through our community engagement and risk communications networks in the communities, to see what's coming up through those listening devices and to see how we can respond to it. We have a wide breadth of myth busters, for example, and I'll share some of these later on while I'm presenting.
Great, thank you so much. I do think we are going to have to move on because we have two more speakers. So Sandy, please stick around and we'll see if we have a little bit more time later on. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, we have a poll here, which we would like you to respond to, and we want to know what the biggest challenges you face around effective COVID-19 risk communication in your city. Take a moment and review this, and I'll report the results out later on before we end. Now, as you're finishing up answering the poll, let's move on our agenda. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, we're going to focus on experiences on the ground now. We'll be hearing from two city experts, Mervat Al-Murhat from Amman, Jordan, and Dr. Annalise Barron from Montevideo, Uruguay. We'll begin with Dr. Mervat. Dr. Mervat has been the Deputy City Manager of Health and Agricultural Affairs in Amman, Jordan since 2017. She has over 20 years of experience in the management of the public health sector in Jordan and is the COVID-19 lead for that city. Don't forget to put your questions into the Q&A and we'll get to them at the end. Next slide.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Mervat Al-Murhat from Amman, Jordan. And I would like to thank you, everybody, to listen to me and let me show you my experience in Amman, Jordan. I am going to speak today about risk communication for COVID from Amman perspective, point of view as a Greater Amman municipality, as a city of Amman. Please, next slide. First of all, I would like to generally speak, this is the economic crisis as a result of health crisis, which shows us a tsunami in not only in Amman or in Jordan, it's all over the world. So let's say Jordan is a very poor country. there's a lack of resources. We have focusing only on food security and agriculture. We have a poor production. So crises like this can cause a huge effect on our economy and on our health and even on our social impact all over the Jordan, not only in Amman. But first of all, we have to start to learn ourselves about this new crisis. So we gone to the research and we cooperate with international organizations such as WHO. The mental component of a public health risk management, and we focus on the dialogue of this affect the concern about the struggles and the fears of the citizen. So I'm not going to speak about the communication process. Greater Amman Municipality has a special press center, and she has a special website and social media. But still, we need more and more about confidential and pure scientific resources as an organization to move on and to build our community secure system. So we start, first of all, King Abdullah issued a decree of guarantee the government to sweeping the power of the basic rights of a human to have their rights to move on all over the country. But the lockdown all over the country has been started about the mid of, let's say, March. It had been all lockdown, all the city. So we also create a structure of committees in Greater Amman Municipality. First of all, the Committee of Health, which I am the technical lead. And we have the main service committee and the social product committee and implementation committee. These committees start to bring out all our conditions and SOPs, how we can handle the city and all over the country. As a city, next slide, please. As a city, we start to focus on raising the awareness. First of all, for our employee, we have 23,000 of our employee. For the citizen of Amman, Amman, of course, it's half of Jordan. We need to raise the awareness among all Jordanian people. So we send messages for the citizen about COVID in cooperation, of course, with the Ministry of Health, because Ministry of Health is the reference, our reference. It's the reference body for us to get the right information. And we start to control health control here. It's the health inspection. We start to inspect all over the aspect of life in Amman, especially the restaurants and the business shops, the construction project. And we need to sanitize all area of Amman by using, of course, sanitization and disinfectant allowed from WHO. The slaughterhouse, we need to sustain the mobility of the city, starting from slaughterhouse, from the wholesale market, and we need to use the more safe sanitizer, food sanitizer. Next, please, slide. Of course, the impact of COVID news on social media, we gain it from all aspects of, analyze it from all aspects of life. Starting from our websites. Of course, the uncertainty of news, of course, one of the most difficult elements of risk communication, and a right of incomplete information as any part of all the world. Everybody developed his own knowledge based on the social media, and this is the uncertainty we face it on our city. The satisfaction, of course, of community and citizens was very low at the beginning of the crisis, and because of a lot of, let's say, rumors here and there. There's a lot of rumors. So we need to communicate easily with with the citizen. We built a trust and transparency with the citizens by call of actions, by making a clear message information, by supplying all the basics of sanitization of all aspects of the city. The information is reliable. We develop a manual for all aspects of the city and give it away for other ministries and other stakeholders or NGOs, and we give it away for the citizen. It's allowed and it's available in our website, on our social media. Of course, the role of risk communication based on presentation discussed to follow the risk communication, it's help inform decision. The mayor, first of all, at the beginning of the crisis, he said we need to build our decision based on this risk, based on the information, and encourage the protective behavior. We motivate people to protect themselves by knowledge, by social distance, by follow up the instruction of WHO and Ministry of Health, coordinate with all aspects, health aspects in the city, Ministry of Health, Ministry of
Dr. Mirbat, I do have to thank you for your presentation. I'm so very sorry to have to interrupt because this is fascinating.
And, thank you very much. And
yeah,
I'm almost finished, but I would like to thank you very much. And I would finalize my presentation to say that trust is very important issue to develop, and there is communication in any city. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We're going to move now. Actually, we're going to have a little change of agenda because we know that one of our panelists has to leave. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Jamie Guerra. So Nana, I'm going to let you allow your screen sharing with her. And Jamie, if you can pick up, we'll go from there. So Jamie is going to join us from the World Health Organization. She's one of our partners there.
Thanks, and I'm sharing my screen now so you can see our main coronavirus page. I'm from the Department of Communication and happy to present to you today a little bit of what we're doing and some of the best resources that you can have for risk communications from the World Health Organization. So as you can see, and just to echo what our colleagues said earlier, we really believe in communicating as early and as often as possible. So we are communicating with the public on a daily basis through various channels. And you can see here and use for your own purposes to keep up to date and also communicate with your audiences. We have our live press conferences streaming out from several platforms, including Twitter, LinkedIn, our main website, as you can see here, our YouTube station, and others. So those are now streamed live in 6 UN languages. We also have Swahili and Hindi that are being added, so please stay tuned for that. We're very excited that we were able to do this and communicate to the media across the globe in real time, and that's a really important tool for us. And a couple other tools just to run through this quickly. You see our questions and answers here, which is really aimed towards the general public. We also have daily situation reports, and I'll just open this next page where you can see this has been going on every day since before we declared it a public health emergency on the 30th of January. So the first one started on the 21st of January, and that gives an overview of the daily situation globally. And what they've done is start focusing on different countries where the epidemic, sort of hot spots for the epidemic. So I think that's been a really helpful tool within the situation reports as well. And regarding the question asked earlier about infodemic management, and again, we'll share all links there in my presentation, which will be shared afterwards, I believe, and I'll send on any that weren't included. But this is the page from our risk communications team on what we're doing to manage misinformation. So it's identifying what those rumors or wrong information, what it is, and then simplifying the message to ensure that our audiences can understand them and that it's not too technical or scientific. You need to remember that to talk in very simple language, as many of you are the top experts in your field, to really talk as if you're speaking with your young children or your family who is not working in this area. And then we amplify those out through our social media. So we have a lot of tools, different tools to do that. In terms of training, we have a massive open online courses through Open WHO, and they've launched a specific series for coronavirus to help train, and many of those are in risk communications as well. So you can see some are technical and for health workers, and others are for risk communications, but this outlines some of the specific guidance and online courses and what languages they are available in. And to stay up to date on a weekly basis, the best tool I would say, and I would encourage everyone to sign up to get this in their email. You just email the EpiWin network to request these weekly updates straight to your inbox. And this explains what WHO is doing on a weekly basis and what the sort of to manage that misinformation or to get the latest scientific guidance to distill it for general public. So this comes out every week. This one's focused on the clinical trials for therapeutics for coronavirus. And it explains...
Jamie, I need to interrupt. We do need to move more quickly. Dr. Barone is waiting to give her presentation. We only
Absolutely. Okay, so I'll let you look through that. And she's already presented sort of emergency risk communications, but this is another tool you can use. This is more in preparedness terms for countries or cities that haven't been hardest hit yet to start writing plans. And we have everything available on our website. Apologies, and that's here. And again, all these links will be sent out. In terms of social media, you are more than welcome to use all of the social media squares that WHO develops. And those are available on our Canto sharing. It's a graphic design sharing platform here. They're available in all 6 UN languages: Arabic, Chinese, French, Spanish, in English, and a few others as well. We've also sent out through our WhatsApp and Viber and Facebook Messenger messages specifically to the global audiences on risk communications and what they can do to best protect themselves. I hope that was helpful, and happy to answer any questions after this as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jamie. We're going to have to move on quickly. We're going to go back to Montevideo. Dr. Barone will be speaking now. She's a physician by training and has been the director of Montevideo's health division since 2014. She's going to be speaking in Spanish, but nobody needs to change their translation channel. I know we only have a couple of minutes. Dr. Barone, to you.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. Now, in this global health crisis, next slide, please. Montevideo has been following, since the beginning, recommendations by the governing body at Uruguay, the Ministry of Public Health. Likewise, they immediately took up the declaration for a health emergency on March 13th, when the 4th case of COVID-19 was declared. And initiatives that they were able to cooperate with to minimize risk and reduce damage. That very day, all officials over 60 were withdrawn from the workplace, as well as any pregnant officials, and all of those with increased risk due to comorbidities, immune depression, cancer treatment, etc. There was also priority given for stay-at-home measures for those who had children under 12 years of age in order to favor their care, given the closure of all the educational centers in the country. Next slide, please. Immediately, a crisis committee was formed, made up by the Human Management Directorate, the directors for every department who were called depending on the, who attended depending on the area that was being dealt with, the directors from the syndicate and the health directorate. Every department was analyzed to determine risk, establish protocols, and gather the necessary supplies, personal protection equipment, etc. The communications department redesigned the municipal government's page in order to inform the population of the new situation, ways of working, online procedures. They started being over 5,000 action protocols, advice for personal care and community care, etc. Immediately, there was a gathering of the transportation companies to be able to establish mass transportation protocols, which should be made clear that foreseeing greater circulation and having established obligatory use of face masks, 100,000 reusable face masks are being given away to the population at the points where there is the most flow to promote their use. Next slide, please. Polyclinic centers remained open, reshaping their way of working with triage upon entry, carrying out phone appointments to avoid gathering of people, and people who to be able to see to people with chronic illnesses that had to be controlled, as well as pregnancy and newborns. Next slide, please. There was a vaccination campaign implemented ahead of time for influenza, reason for which the vaccination places were and vaccination days were implemented at different places in the municipality, and making sure that that workers in essential departments such as cleaning, sanitation, and health were vaccinated. Next slide, please. The food regulatory service, the bromatology department, was refurnished. Next slide, please. There was a minimum staff placed there, such as food lab, moving all the rest of the staff to remote work, and making sure that they were able to deal with the population, particularly given the initiatives such as the food kitchens that had begun to arise almost immediately due to the confinement, as well as for delivery of food at home, which obviously grew exponentially. What you are seeing there on your screen is one of the recommendations that the municipality is giving out to these soup kitchens. Next slide, please. In a few days, over a few days, the conditioning and delivery of 10,000 food baskets of 30 kilos each to the most vulnerable population. Of course, this week we'll start with the delivery of 10,000 more food baskets. Next slide, please. As of 21 April 21st, when we came up with this presentation, Uruguay had 543 confirmed cases of COVID-19, 324 already recovered, 207 still in progress, of which 10 are in intensive care, none in intermediate care, and to date, 12 people have passed away in Uruguay. These people affected by COVID-19 are distributed over 9 out of the 19 administrative departments at Uruguay, and it is worth mentioning that 80% are in Montevideo. The total of confirmed cases from the beginning add up to 613 confirmed cases. Next slide. Thank you very much, and I am here for any question.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Barone. We're out of time, which is tragic because that was a wonderful presentation. But if people have put questions into the Q&A, we will get back to you individually. So let's just close this out. Next slide, please. So if you could also please just indicate in the Q&A what other strategies you're using to communicate about risk to the public. We'll share them next week. Next slide. Keep going. Next slide. Next slide. Keep going through these slides. I think Jamie did these. Keep going. Okay, one last thing I want to just point you towards is the citiesforhealth.org website. Go back, please. There are some other additional resources that are there that you can see. They are in purple, they're noted in purple. So please take a look at them when you have a chance. Let's continue on, next slide. Next slide. All right, so just to let you know, about 60% of you indicated that communication on countermeasures was the biggest challenge you're facing. We'll be looking at some of those issues next week. So the evaluation questions will be mailed after this webinar. We hope you'll respond. We'll also make slides and additional materials for your adaptation available as well. Please save 2 dates. Next week on April 28th, there is a webinar for mayors about communication during a crisis. So please let your chief executives know. And then on April 30th, we have another technical webinar for ethical and legal considerations for a city response. So therefore, invite your city leads, particularly people who are involved in policy development or leading implementation efforts, to join. Next slide. I want to thank all of you for attending. I want to thank our wonderful speakers, and I want to thank Bluebird Philanthropies for supporting this, and our partners, the World Health Organization, Partnership for Healthy Cities, and Vital Strategies for producing this webinar. Hope to see you next week. Thanks so much. Stay safe.